I have a fellow pastor and friend who on the signature line of her email has this quote from Wendy Mass. It says, "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about." And I'm thinking about taking that from her and using it myself. Because whenever I get done reading an email from my friend, and I read her name and then I read this quote, it is such a great reminder about what's happening in other people's lives. And just that first two simple words is a great reminder for how I can be a compassionate person in this world. To be kind. And that can look very different for each of us in how our kind response will be. But it gets us going in the right direction. And unfortunately, in our world today, we are seeing more and more of a need for this type of kindness and compassion. I found this week that there is a new study that has discovered that nearly half of all Americans, 56% in fact, say that they feel lonely, with our younger generation being 30 and under, feeling the brunt of that pain. Now, this study was sponsored by a health insurer, a big one called Cigna, but they took this nationwide survey of over 20,000 adults, those over the age of 18, and found that 54% of respondents said they feel like no one actually knows them very well. And approximately 40% of the respondents said that they, quote, lack companionship, that their relationships aren't meaningful, and that they feel isolated from others. Now, these numbers really surprise me, but maybe they shouldn't have. I say they surprise me because we live in an age of social media and instant connection with people around the world. We no longer are just in our small neighborhoods and communities, but maybe that's not such a good thing. Maybe it's not helping in the ways we think it is or would like them to. Because people are finding that some of those relationships are not, as they say, quote unquote, meaningful. They're not providing that connection. They're not providing maybe some of the support. Now, for others, that's completely different. Some find great support and encouragement from friends that they may only know via Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. But there is a disconnect. Because the generations, starting with what they call Generation Z, those who were born in Generation Z, those that were born between 90 and 2000, they're actually giving the highest numbers of feeling lonely and isolated. And as we look back to the greatest generation and the baby boomers, while some of them are still expressing a loneliness and a disconnection, they're talking about maybe in the 30 percentile range versus in the 50 and nearly 60 percentile range. So we have an issue. We have a problem. And this lack of connection and social isolation from others is leading to some pretty disturbing things as well. An increase in anxiety, and depression and a decrease in things like self-esteem and self-acceptance. So, what can we do to reverse this trend? Well, I think we start with Jesus' call to compassion. I think we follow the example of Jesus and begin to work at becoming a compassionate listener and healer. Now, when you go to the New Testament and you begin to read about Jesus' earthly ministry, and we have so many wonderful stories in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where Jesus is going out with his disciples and he is having interactions with so many different people. Not just people within his sort of so-called social group or in his sort of religious group, but he's meeting people of all walks of life. And he's meeting them on the road as he is traveling from place to place. And he's meeting them outside of the synagogues, and he's meeting them in their homes. And so many of those stories, we have people that are coming to Jesus to ask him to help them. Whether it's to be fed spiritually or physically, to be healed emotionally or spiritually or physically. And we've talked about how this ministry can sometimes seem overwhelming for Jesus, and when that happens, Jesus has to go and step away for a little while and go off by himself and pray and renew himself. But he comes back to it day after day after day. And there's a common refrain of things that are repeated in these stories. And one of those words that keeps coming up again and again and again is it says Jesus had compassion for the woman who was in front of him or the crowd that was gathered around him. And when we hear that famous story about the feeding of the 5,000, that is one of the first places we hear about Jesus saying he had compassion on the crowds, and he turned to his disciples and he said, "We need to feed these people." That's the kind thing to do. That's the compassionate thing to do. And while the disciples had no clue at first how to do that, they trusted that what Jesus was talking to them about and teaching them that that moment was the right thing to do, and they found a way through Christ to do that. But we have a great story in the Gospel of Matthew that's, again, one of these very short stories. It's only about 3-4 verses long. And it says that then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. And it says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And later on, the Apostle Paul, in his own ministry and in his own writing, came to write about this quality of Jesus and how, as followers of Jesus, we are called to clothe ourselves in that same way. And he says in his letter to the Colossians, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Well, this all sounds really good, right? Sounds like something we should all be able to probably do. But what gets in our way of following in this path of kindness and compassion? I think the answer might surprise us. And I'm not saying this is the only answer. But I think one of the things that truly is an obstacle for us and a roadblock, if you will, to a path of living more compassionately is this word called busyness. Anyone ever been busy before? How many times, ballpark, especially us adults, but even our kids, how often do you find yourself saying, "Oh, I am just so busy today"? Or "I was just so busy, I couldn't get that done this week." Or "I'm sorry, I just was so busy, I couldn't return that phone call." You hear that repetition? Busy, busy, busy. Now, I didn't go back and do my great research, but I believe there is a Chinese symbol for busy. And I believe it interprets something like a tearing of the heart. Meaning it literally divides us, takes our attention away, makes us feel like we're running in 16 different directions, right? And boy, I've used the word busy too often in my life. But it's a roadblock and an obstacle for us to be compassionate people, because when we're too busy, we fail to pay attention to those who are around us. And so if we're going to model Jesus, we need to look at what Jesus really did in order to be compassionate and to have compassion for others. And the first thing is that Jesus slowed down. Now, part of that was the time, right? There were no cars, there was no internet, there isn't a way to get from here to there instantaneously. So Jesus walked everywhere. And Jesus had meetings, not only in synagogues, but in fields. The Sermon on the Mount, he brought people up on the mountain by the lake, and they had a talk, and Jesus listened. But he slowed down enough to allow that opportunity for conversation. And then Jesus took notice of the people around him. So sometimes when they would be traveling, people would call out to Jesus and say, "Jesus, Jesus, over here, we need you." But a lot of times there were things done in very silent, subtle ways. A woman who came just to touch Jesus' cloak so that she could be made well, because she trusted that if she could just get a piece of Jesus, she would be well. And Jesus turned and talked to her and engaged her and heard her story, even as brief as it was. But he slowed down. He paid attention to the people around him. He asked how people were doing or what he could do for them. And then he listened for the answer. And that's a big piece of it. Too many times when we're so busy, we can ask the questions, but as we're hearing the answer, we're already, maybe if not physically, mentally 3 steps away. And I am guilty of this myself. And some days are better than others. We know that too, right? When you have 60 things on your mind and you're trying not to add any more. Again, sometimes we can be good at asking the question, but are we listening for the answer. And if we're trying to follow Jesus and to be more like Jesus, then we are called to take the time to listen. And then finally, to respond with empathy. To try and put ourselves in that person's shoes, to try and figure out maybe what that battle is that we didn't know about, but now maybe we do. And I had to learn this the hard way, that when we have and we respond with empathy, it's not about fixing the problem. It's about understanding and walking with people as they deal with that problem or they struggle with that challenge. It's to help them know that they are not alone. And I can't tell you how many folks have felt that power of connection and community and support, and that has been what has gotten them through. It's not somebody coming and trying to fix their problem for them, but that they know that they have people with them that are going to love them through whatever challenge it is that they are going through at that moment. And friends, God has given us the gifts to care for and to connect with others and to help them feel that they belong, especially, but not only in the church, but in our communities, and that their lives matter to God, to Christ, and in the world. Because sadly, friends, when people feel like they don't have any connection, when they feel like they are alone, when they feel like no one cares, then they lose the most precious gift of all that God gives us, and that's the gift of hope. And as the church, we are called to be bearers of light and hope in this world. And we have the gifts within us, and they are simple gifts, but they are powerful gifts. To slow down, to take notice, to listen, and to love. Amen?